Hell's Wench was hit. Behind the controls, Lieutenant Colonel Addison Baker knew this, but he knew something else too. His plane led the way to Ploiești refineries, and he'd promised his men he'd bring them to their targets. Another hit, harder this time. The plane was burning. Approaching from the south, Lieutenant Carl Barthel, navigator for the B-24th Liberator Queenie, saw the horror as it played out in the Romanian summer skies. Baker had been burning for about 3 minutes, Barthel said. The right wing began to drop. I don't see how anyone could have been alive in that cockpit, but someone kept her leading the force on between the refinery stacks. Decisions are made quickly out in the field. Chance outcomes, fine margins between life and death. Personal heroism and valor. Selflessness. This is what made the difference at Ploiești on a day that would become known as Black Sunday. The Ruhr Valley, Kassel, Hamburg, Magdeburg. Centers of industry that kept Germany going during the war. Factories in these locations and in many others pumped out the components the Germans needed to run their blitzkrieg. Knocking out this production, taking these facilities offline permanently, became one of the Allies' top priorities. There were other priorities too, like transport networks. The mass mobilization of German troops ahead of the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 depended on the rail transport of the Deutsche Reichsbahn. Even more grimly, so did the mass extermination of Jews and other minorities during the Holocaust. Shattering this network was also high on the agenda. None of this is a secret. With the Battle of Britain won, the Allies began to turn the tables on the Luftwaffe, hitting targets across Germany and hitting them hard. RAF estimates suggest Kassel was 69% destroyed by bombing by the war's end. In Hamburg, 3/4 of the city lay in ruins. At Bochum, on the Ruhr, the figure was 83%. The Dambusters raid, the daylight missions of the 8th Air Force, the stories of sorties over Germany have been passed down from generation to generation. But not all of these raids are so well known. Operations like Tidal Wave and Clarion helped cripple the Axis war effort, stacking the odds overwhelmingly in favor of the Allies. But these stories are all too forgotten, lost in the chaos and confusion that is the Second World War. We want to redress this balance today, so join us as we tell these forgotten tales. Less than 50 kilometers separate the Romanian towns of Ploiești and Târgoviște. This was just a short hop on a lengthy mission from bases in Libya across the Mediterranean to the oil refineries of Ploiești, north of the Romanian capital, Bucharest. But to the B-24 Liberator bombers that swept over the land, the tangle of rivers and valleys blended into a confusing sprawl. The plane stayed low, navigators scanning the ground as it passed beneath them, searching for Florești and the turn from here toward Ploiești. In the lead, Colonel Compton of the TGN spots his marker, the road leading south. This is it. He signals to his pilot, the approach. The 25 bombers of the lead formation set their course 127 degrees for the south, ready to engage their targets. Deep into enemy-held territory, there is radio silence. The situation is tense, but something's wrong. The marker Compton spotted was incorrect. They are off course. Norman Appold of the GI Ginny cannot contain himself any longer. Not here, he shouts across the radio, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. On board Duchess, flight leader Ramsey Potts makes his own voice heard. Mistake, he yells, mistake. They're not on the road to Ploiești, but are headed south to Bucharest. But this is no surprise attack. The Axis defenders are well aware of what's going on. The diversion toward Bucharest stuns them, but only for a second. As Operational Command tries desperately to bring the lead B-24s back into line, enemy fighters are in the air and they're ready to engage. The miscalculations split the force, leaving planes and their crews woefully exposed. Brewery Wagon, piloted by John Palm, had not followed the shift to the south. Instead, she carried on toward Ploiești, coming in from the west as intended and preparing to strike. But the city now bristled with guns, and a huge number of these guns were trained right on the brewery wagon, alone as she roared overhead. Anti-aircraft fire rocked the aircraft until a direct hit busted her nose wide open, killing both the navigator and the bombardier. Desperate for those lives not to have been lost in vain, Lieutenant Palm battled to hold his course, but his plane bucked and kicked despite his efforts. The blast had almost severed the pilot's leg, and he knew the game was up. Jettisoning the payload west of his target, Palm turned the brewery wagon and made a break for it, but a Messerschmitt was hot on his tail. Shattered by anti-aircraft fire and by the Messerschmitt's cannons, the brewery wagon began to disintegrate. Palm made one last effort to gain height, giving his surviving men a fighting chance at bailing out, but it was to no avail. Brewery wagon came down heavily onto the Romanian countryside. Palm would survive. His leg was amputated by Axis doctors following his capture. Brewery wagon might have missed her target, but she had dropped her payload around Ploiești, and she was not alone. The squeal of the falling ordnance and the roar of detonation, the thick black smoke belching into the autumn sky, the unmistakable evidence of a raid in progress. Returning from the Bucharest road, the crew of the Teghian saw this unfold. They were to the south of Ploiești now, and the city and her refineries were opening up to their left. Leading the 93rd Bomb Group, Lieutenant Corporal Addison Baker knew what he had to do. He had to turn his plane, Hell's Wench, and he had to lead the others to their targets. Further back in the formation, Lieutenant Russell Longnecker, pilot of the Thundermug, was awestruck. He maneuvered our group more eloquently than if he had radio contact with each of us, Lieutenant Longnecker said. He turned left 90 degrees. We all turned with him. Ploiești was off there to the left, and we were going straight into it, and we were going fast. The attack was still on. Alongside Baker in the cockpit of Hell's Wench was Major John Gersted. Together, Baker and Gersted sought to lead the first wave to their targets on the east side of the city. It was only then, while crossing the open ground between the formation and the refineries, that Baker and Gersted realized just how well armed the city was. Anti-aircraft guns, disguised as haystacks, roared to life. Axis fighters, prepped and primed as to the importance of the refinery as a target, engaged their assailants. It was a bloodbath. Practically all of the aircraft in the first wave were hit. Hell's Wench took catastrophic damage, and yet Baker and Gersted pressed on. At the briefing, Baker had said, "I'm going to take you to this target if my plane falls apart doing it." Now, those words were coming true. Arriving from the Bucharest road to the south, Lieutenant Colonel George Brown saw this unfold from the cockpit of Queenie at the head of the second wave. He saw Utah Man, the sole survivor of the first wave, drop her payload on the refinery. He saw a flaming Hell's Wench struggling to lead her line, and he saw the desperate crew bailing out at the last moment. When Hell's Wench finally came down, it missed Queenie by only a few feet. Struck by the horror of the situation, Brown understood what must come next. He brought his second wave in on the refineries of Ploiești. At any cost, somehow and by some way, the objectives would be completed. Author and flyer William J. Philly, who was himself captured after his plane was shot down by the Luftwaffe in 1944, was frequently enraged by the public perception of the Ploiești raid. Writing in the late 1990s, Philly described how remarks like, "You guys really screwed up that mission," made his blood boil. These persons make such statements without any knowledge of what took place in those liberated bombers, he said. Historians and the media did not tell mankind that those intrepid American airmen were determined and brave enough to go against an enemy who was well experienced in aerial and ground combat. These men, most in their late teens, did battle with the most formidable and determined enemy. Their efforts to help bring about the end of World War II will forever be remembered in the annals of aviation history. 177 liberated bombers took off from Libya on August 1st, 1943. Only 162 of these reached the target area. 53 of these liberators were brought down over Romania with 530 men on board. Only 130 of these downed airmen lived to tell the tale after lengthy stays in POW camps. In a human sense, the mission was disastrous. So many young American airmen fed into the meat grinder on that August afternoon in 1943. But what about in a military sense? The common perception has always been that Tidal Wave was a failure, but many, including William J. Philly, didn't see it that way. As Philly himself pointed out, more than 50% of German petroleum supplies were delayed for about 6 months. The German war machine and the armaments miracle of Minister for War Production, Albert Speer, couldn't run on thin air. It needed oil, it needed fuel. For such a huge swath of petroleum production to be knocked out like that, this was bad news for the Germans. We've also got to think about the broader context. What else was going on in August 1943? To the south and west, the Allies now controlled North Africa, and the invasion of Italy was underway. Even with Italian forces on the ground, there was still a heavy reliance on German oil, in particular oil from the Romanian refineries. To the north and east, there was fierce fighting across a massive front as the Soviet troops sought to push back the German invaders. The battles of Belgorod, Kharkov and Smolensk would all take place in August, while Kursk, the largest tank battle in the history of warfare, would last almost the entire month. The Germans always needed oil, but now they needed it more than ever. Such a lengthy delay, at the worst possible time, crippled the Wehrmacht in the east and brought the Axis forces in Italy to the brink of surrender. The sacrifices made by the men of the 8th and 9th Air Force on that day, and the role they played in bringing about the end of the conflict, must be remembered. More than a year and a half after the enormous losses over Ploiești, a very different operation was unfolding. While the Ploiești refineries had been a concentrated target, Operation Clarion, launched on February 22, 1945, as the war entered its final stages, was a systematic assault on cities across Germany. The objective? To knock out the Germans' transport and communication network, grinding the German resistance to a halt. On the first day of the assault, 1,372 B-17 and B-24 bombers of the 8th Air Force took off from their bases, supported by 677 fighter planes. The Luftwaffe, now a shadow of its former self after heavy losses across Europe, struggled to offer up any meaningful resistance. The greatest opposition came near Bremen, where a little over 25 Focke-Wulf FW-190s and a handful of Messerschmitt Me-109s engaged the bombers. Elsewhere, resistance forces were even weaker. 15 Me-262s near Berlin, 12 around Stendal-Brandenburg, and 6 around Stettin. At Salzwedel, only a single Me-262 offered resistance, while at Helmstedt, only 2 came out to meet the assailants. The fighter escorts held off their attackers, and the bombers came in on their targets low. Fields of flak opened up as the objectives drew near, but the bombers were undaunted. Only one of the bombers was lost on that first day, downed by one of the Me-262 defenders. The Allied assault was crushing. Ansbach received 420 tons of ordnance. Ulm, Wittenberger, Stendal and Uelzen all received well over 200 tons, with Salzwedel and Bamberg hit with 197 and 187 tons each. Bombers dropped more than 100 tons each on Hildesheim, Peine, Ludwigslust, Kleinsen, Nordheim, Lüneburg and Halberstadt. A further 22 cities were hit with between 20 and 100 tons, while Kitzingen, Ocker and Zwickau were also hit. Fighter units strafed targets on the ground, destroying some 44 aircraft and 104 locomotives, along with oil tank cars and rail cars. Down in the southwest, around 800 B-17s and B-24s moved against targets across a vast area. The sorties hit 32 marshalling yards and knocked 110 locomotives, 40 oil tank cars and 300 rail cars out of action. Meanwhile, 465 bombers of the 9th Air Force were in action up in the northwest, smashing railway infrastructure, including bridges and junctions, with a bombed 850 tons of ordnance. The 9th claimed to have lost 3 bombers and 12 fighters in the assault. The 1st Air Tactical Command sent 171 bombers out against rail targets in this area too, losing 8 of them, but destroying 10 bridges and 38 locomotive units. Bombers from the British Royal Air Force also ran missions, hitting transport and communication links, as well as the Bensol plant at Osterfeld. Military marshalling yards and rail infrastructure were the prime targets on the first day, and the good visibility, combined with the scant resistance, made success almost certain for these raids. Objectives across the target areas were knocked out of action, but there was major damage elsewhere too. In Hildesheim, the marshalling yard objective was damaged heavily, but 102 civilian homes were destroyed in the process, and almost 1,000 residences were damaged. The city's historic cathedral and St. Michael's Church both sustained damage too, and the raid cost 250 lives. Despite the civilian casualties, Lieutenant General Karl Spaatz, the commander of the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, was overjoyed with the mission's first day. As long as the clear weather held out, they would go out again the following day. February 23, 1945, it turned out, was indeed clear, and the planes were ordered out once again. On the second day of Clarion, the planes of the 8th Air Force once again came in hard out of clear skies, dropping a combined 3,316 tons on their targets, from Kreilsheim to Ansbach, Gera, Nordlingen, Jena, and Osnabrück, among many others. There was also no resistance from the Luftwaffe. 2 of the bombers were downed, but their crews were rescued. Accompanying fighter groups tore into airfields at Neuburg and elsewhere, as well as transport infrastructure around Augsburg and Frankfurt. At Neuss, a wing of 24 B-24s hit the marshalling yards, dropping 60 tons. To the west, 2,300 medium bombers, fighter bombers, and fighter escorts from the 9th Air Force hit communication centers. 123 locomotives, 3,027 rail cars, 1,317 motor vehicles, 305 armored vehicles, 9 bridges, 20 barges, and a wave of railroad disruption were claimed following the attack. 905 fighters from the 1st Tactical Command also ran sorties in the west, achieving considerable damage, while the RAF's 2nd Tactical Air Command was out in support too, with rail bridges and ammo depots on their target list. In the carnage, Essen was hit by 1,170 tons from the RAF's Lancasters, while 580 tons fell on the Bensol plant at Gelsenkirchen. Down in the south, the 15th Air Force attacked 8 targets to cripple transportation across this region of Germany. Air superiority was key to success in World War II. Long-range bombers and aircraft carriers meant almost nowhere was safe. The Japanese were able to hit Hawaii, while the Allies successfully ran an island-hopping campaign across the largest ocean on the planet. The ability to fly a long way, hit your targets, and potentially come back unscathed was a big deal. And for a while, it was touch and go. Anyone living in London in 1940, or in one of Nazi Germany's other target cities, would have had a pretty clear idea of who was winning the struggle for the skies. But after the RAF's victory at the Battle of Britain, and the arrival of the Americans with their flying fortresses and super fortresses, the balance of power began to shift. By 1945, Germany was getting pulverized by Allied air power, and she was struggling to keep her head above water. James H. Doolittle was no stranger to long-distance raids. The mastermind of the famous Doolittle raid, the lieutenant colonel had hit targets on the Japanese home islands as early as April 1942, and was promoted to lieutenant general and commander of the 8th Air Force later in the war. Doolittle was impressed by the victories scored on February 22nd and 23rd, 1945. Along with Air Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder and Lieutenant General Karl Spaatz, Doolittle hailed the excellent results of Operation Clarion. The huge amount of damage inflicted in 2 short days of bombing speaks for itself. Germany, now fighting a desperate battle for survival on 2 fronts, could not afford to have her transport and communication networks battered like this. Clarion was perhaps not the final nail in the coffin, but it certainly helped dig the grave. Not everyone agreed though. The Joint Intelligence Committee was less than impressed with the outcome of the operation, reporting to Air Marshal Charles Portal the RAF's chief of staff, that Clarion had no significant effect on German resistance. Portal said that no further bombing raids of this type should be carried out. Right or wrong, this would turn out to be the case. Once the final bombers returned to their bases on February 23rd, Operation Clarion was terminated. It would be the last operation of this kind. But is this fair? The Battle of the Bulge, the last major stand for the Wehrmacht on the Western Front, was over and the Siegfried Line was breached. Meaningful German resistance on her western borders was now impossible, and the Soviets had brought their own offensive forwards after the Allied success in the Ardennes. But Germany was still standing. The last bastions of her resistance had not yet fallen. Allied forces in the west still had to cross the Rhine. Operation Clarion laid the groundwork for Operation Grenade and paved the way for success in Operation Veritable. Significant Allied advances in the Rhineland. Allied forces crossed the Rohr and shattered the German divisions on the west bank of the Rhine. The following month, Allied forces would cross the Rhine. The race to Berlin would be won by the Soviets, but the western pincer of the Allied advance would be critical in squeezing the last drops of life out of the Axis in Europe. Could this have been achieved without Operation Clarion? Possibly. Germany was on the back foot after her defeat at the Bulge, and overwhelming advances on both fronts were gnawing away at her resolve and her resources. Did Operation Clarion make a difference? Undoubtedly. Nazi Germany could not repair her transportation and communication networks, and logistics became impossible. Deployed troops stayed in their lines without hope of resupply or rotation, and panic began to set in. Staunch resistance came from die-hard Nazis, proud German nationalists, and well-drilled professional soldiers alike, but without rail infrastructure to back them up, and without a communication network to orchestrate them, their efforts amounted to nothing more than a series of valiant last stands. Germany survived another spring, but she would not see the summer. By May, the war in Europe was over. Operation Clarion played a huge part in accelerating this rapid decline. From Brest to Berlin, from Cologne to Casablanca, and from Tallinn to Tokyo, Allied bombing raids were instrumental in winning the war. Countless airmen lost their lives in thousands of raids across all theaters, and vast amounts of expensive hardware ended up destroyed, transformed into burning carcasses that littered the landscape. There were also enormous civilian casualties. The suffering at Dresden, Leipzig, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki are well known, but they only scratch the surface. While some raids have become the stuff of legend, others have almost been forgotten. Operation Tidal Wave and the enormous toll paid by the pilots and bomber crew on that day in 1943 is one of those missions that has been unfairly sidelined in the story of the war. Operation Clarion, with its destruction of infrastructure on an enormous scale, is another. Both of these raids were instrumental in shattering German resistance at pivotal moments in the war. Without these raids, resistance may have dragged on through the summer or even beyond, with thousands more lives lost. When the story of World War II is written, we can't forget what went on during these raids and the debt we owe to the crews who ran them. But what do you think? How important were Tidal Wave and Clarion to the war effort? What other forgotten raids and missions should we cover? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.